A wine glass shattered against the terracotta floor as three massive Rottweilers lunged forward in perfect formation, their collective snarl vibrating through the small Italian bistro like an earthquake. Grown men dove beneath red and white checkered tablecloths, their designer shoes scraping against wood as they scrambled for cover. The restaurant owner pressed himself against the far wall, his face drained of all color. At that exact moment, Georgina, a waitress who hadn't made eye contact with a customer in 5 years and always took the back exit to avoid being seen, stepped directly into the kill zone. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She just opened her mouth and released a single guttural command in an ancient dialect that hadn't been spoken in public for decades. The three beasts dropped to their bellies simultaneously, their massive heads hitting the floorboards with audible thuds. Complete silence. Behind them, Simone Inzaghi, known throughout the region as the Butcher, a man who'd never shown fear in his entire brutal career, stood frozen with both hands pressed against his head, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. He wasn't just seeing a defiant waitress. He was recognizing a bloodline he thought had been buried forever. The same one that had once trained the most lethal dogs in the entire European underworld. Please tell me in the comments what city you are listening from and hit that subscribe button for good luck tomorrow. Georgina had perfected the art of becoming furniture. For 5 years, she'd moved through the world like a shadow, present but unnoticed, helpful but forgettable. She kept her hair dyed an unremarkable mousy brown, though her natural black would catch the light in ways that reminded people of old photographs, of families they might recognize. She wore oversized sweaters that hid her frame, kept her posture slightly hunched, and had trained herself to look at people's collarbones instead of their eyes. Direct eye contact created memory. Memory created recognition. Recognition created death. The morning routine never varied. She arrived at Trattoria Bella Vista at 5:30, a full hour before Marco, the owner, stumbled in smelling of sambuca and cigarettes. She'd prep the espresso machine, wipe down the tables, and arrange the chairs so that the one near the kitchen door, her preferred station, faced away from the street. The position let her monitor the front entrance through the antique mirror mounted above the wine rack, as giving her precious seconds to slip into the back if anyone remotely familiar walked through that door. She'd become an expert at reading the bell above the entrance. A cheerful jingle meant tourists or regulars. A hesitant chime meant first-timers, nervous about whether they belonged. But a confident, deliberate ring, the kind that came from someone who owned every room they entered. That sound made her pulse spike and her hands reach instinctively for the kitchen's back exit. The hardest part wasn't the hiding. It was the constant suppression of who she actually was. 2 weeks ago, she'd watched a man yank his Doberman's choke chain so violently the dog's front paws left the pavement. The animal had merely been tracking a scent, a completely natural behavior, and the owner's correction was textbook abuse. Poorly timed, excessive force, guaranteed to create anxiety and aggression. Georgina's fingers had twitched. Her throat had tightened around words she couldn't say, commands that would have corrected the situation in seconds. The dog had looked at her as they passed, and for one terrible moment, she'd seen recognition in its eyes. Not of her specifically, but of what she was. Dogs always knew. She'd turned away, pretending to examine a shop window until they were gone, her reflection showing a woman who looked like she might cry. That night, she'd barely slept. Yesterday morning, a stray had followed her for 3 blocks, a scruffy terrier mix with matted fur and a slight limp. It had been trying to communicate, doing that specific dance where dogs attempt to engage someone they sense understands them. The terrier had play-bowed, then circled, then sat directly in her path with one paw raised, a clear request for help. Georgina had seen the infected cut on its pad, knew exactly which antibacterial wash would work, could have gained its trust in under 60 seconds. Instead, she'd crossed the street and walked faster, leaving the terrier sitting on the corner, confused by her rejection. She'd heard it whine once, a sound that carved into her chest like a blade. But she hadn't looked back. She never looked back. The constant vigilance meant she noticed things other people missed. The way Marco's arthritic hip made him favor his left side, exactly like an old shepherd she'd once rehabilitated. How the produce delivery driver's hand tremor suggested either Parkinson's or alcoholism, the same fine motor control issues she'd seen in a kennel master who'd been shell-shocked. Or the world was full of behavioral patterns, of cause and effect, written in body language and micro-expressions, and she couldn't unsee any of it. She'd chosen this bistro specifically because it was small, tucked away on a side street where tourists rarely wandered, and locals came for the food, not the atmosphere. The clientele was predictable: elderly couples, construction workers on lunch breaks, the occasional businessman who'd discovered Marco's incredible carbonara. 5 years, and she'd memorized everyone's order, everyone's schedule, everyone's safe patterns. Marco treated her well enough, never asking questions when she'd shown up that first day with no references and a reluctance to fill out proper employment paperwork. He paid her under the table, let her take the scraps home, and didn't complain when she insisted on keeping her back to the front windows. He probably thought she was running from an abusive husband or hiding from debt collectors, close enough to the truth that she never corrected him. The bell above the door chimed. Cheerful, familiar. Signora Rossi for her morning espresso and cornetto. Georgina smiled without showing teeth, poured the coffee to exact specifications, and returned to her position by the kitchen door. Another day of invisibility, another day of survival. She had no way of knowing it would be her last. The bell didn't jingle. It announced. Georgina's hand froze halfway to the espresso machine, every nerve in her body suddenly firing warning signals she'd learned never to ignore. The sound had been deliberate, but almost contemptuous, the kind produced by someone who pushed doors open rather than pulled them, who expected the world to rearrange itself around their presence. She didn't need the mirror to know this was wrong. The temperature in the room had changed. Conversations died mid-sentence. Silverware stopped clinking against plates. Even Marco, who'd been arguing with the produce supplier in the kitchen, fell silent. The smell hit her next. Expensive cologne, something with bergamot and leather, mixed with something far more primal. Wet fur, metal, and underneath it all, the sharp copper scent of old blood that never quite washes away, no matter how much someone scrubs. Georgina turned slowly, keeping her movements small, unthreatening. Her eyes tracked to the floor first, following the protocol that had kept her alive. Black leather shoes, to custom-made, probably Italian. Wool trousers with a razor-sharp crease. And beside the shoes, 3 sets of enormous paws, their nails clicking against the terracotta tiles in an irregular rhythm that spoke of coiled tension. Her breath caught. She couldn't help it. Her gaze traveled up, despite every instinct screaming at her to look away. 3 Rottweilers, each easily over 100 pounds, their massive heads held at perfect attention, their dark eyes scanning the room with the methodical precision of trained sentries. They weren't pets. They weren't even guard dogs. They were weapons on leashes, and someone had just brought them into a room full of civilians. Marco Antonelli. The voice belonged to a man in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered and imposing, with the kind of groomed beard that required daily maintenance, to Simone Inzaghi. Georgina didn't need an introduction. His face had been in the newspapers often enough, always photographed, leaving courtrooms where charges mysteriously disappeared. "We need to have a conversation about your property." Marco emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, his face already glistening with sweat. "Signor Inzaghi, this is unexpected. Perhaps we could—" "No." Simone walked further into the restaurant, and the dogs moved with him in perfect formation, one at each heel, one slightly ahead. Their chains were thick, military grade, the kind designed to restrain animals that could pull a man off his feet. "Perhaps nothing. I'm here to discuss business, and business doesn't wait for convenient scheduling." The elderly couple at table 3 stood abruptly, leaving cash on their table and hurrying toward the door. Simone didn't even glance at them. One of the construction workers at the bar started to rise, but his companion grabbed his arm, shaking his head fractionally. "Stay invisible. Stay still. Predators track movement." Georgina had instinctively positioned herself behind the espresso machine, using it as a barrier between herself and the dogs. But she was watching them, really watching them, seeing things that made her stomach turn. The one on the left, darker, heavier, had scars on his muzzle and a notch missing from his ear. Recent wounds, poorly healed. The one in the center held his head at an angle that suggested chronic pain, possibly a neck injury from being yanked too hard, too often. The third, slightly smaller but more alert, had the whites of his eyes showing, was a stress signal that meant he was one trigger away from reactive behavior. They'd been trained through pain, through fear, through methods that turned natural protective instincts into uncontrolled aggression. "I'm making investments in this neighborhood," Simone continued, his tone conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. "Property values are rising. Your building is charming, historical. I'm prepared to offer you a very reasonable price for the deed." Marco's hands twisted his apron into knots. "Signor, this building has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather is dead." Simone's voice didn't rise, but the temperature dropped 10 degrees. "Along with his sentimentality, I'm offering you money, Marco, more than this crumbling establishment is worth. You should be grateful." I need time to think." "No." Simone reached down and unclipped the first chain. It fell to the floor with a heavy metallic crash that made everyone in the room flinch. "You need to sign." Another chain dropped. The 2 free dogs remained perfectly still, awaiting orders, but their muscles had tensed, their breathing had changed. "Or you need to refuse." The third chain hit the ground, "and suffer the consequences of disappointing me." All 3 Rottweilers stood unleashed in the center of the bistro, 300 pounds of controlled violence, waiting for a single word to become unstoppable. Marco's face had gone from red to white in the span of a heartbeat. His mouth opened and closed twice before any words emerged. "I cannot sell. Please, Signor Inzaghi, this is all I have. But my family, your family is about to learn a very expensive lesson about the cost of stubbornness." Simone's hand moved to his side, fingers spreading in a gesture that was clearly rehearsed, clearly recognized by the 3 massive dogs standing at attention. Their ears perked forward simultaneously. Their weight shifted to their front legs. Georgina felt her own body responding before her mind could catch up. Her breathing slowed, her stance widened fractionally, her hands dropped to her sides. No. She couldn't. 5 years of discipline, of suppression, of promising herself she'd never again become what her father had made her. She pressed herself harder against the espresso machine, willing herself to be invisible, to let this horror unfold without her interference. "Last chance, Marco." Simone's voice was almost gentle now, not the way a parent might sound before delivering a punishment they claimed to regret. "Sign the deed, or I demonstrate what happens to people who waste my time." I cannot. Mangia! The word exploded through the restaurant like a gunshot. All three Rottweilers launched forward in a coordinated strike pattern that was terrifyingly beautiful in its precision. They formed a triangle, one aimed directly at Marco's throat, the others flanking to cut off any escape route. Their snarls merged into a single sound of promised violence, their paws thundering against the tile as they covered the 15 feet between them and their target in less than 2 seconds. Marco threw his arms up in front of his face, stumbling backward into the kitchen doorway. The construction workers dove beneath their table. Someone screamed. The remaining elderly patron tried to run but tripped over a chair, crashing to the floor. And Georgina moved. She didn't think about it, didn't plan it. Couldn't have stopped herself if she'd wanted to. Her body simply responded to the sight of 3 abused animals being commanded to commit violence they'd been tortured into performing. She stepped out from behind the espresso machine, directly into the kill zone, placing herself between the lunging dogs and Marco's exposed throat. Time seemed to fracture. She could see everything with crystalline clarity. The way the lead dog's eyes had dilated, the foam at the corner of the second dog's mouth, the tension in the third shoulders that meant he was already preparing to redirect if the primary target moved. They were 2 feet away. 1 second from impact. Her throat released sounds she hadn't spoken in 5 years. Sharp, guttural. Commands forged in a dialect that predated modern Italian, words that carried the weight of absolute authority, because they'd been designed specifically to cut through chaos and bloodlust. Zit! The lead dog's front paws skidded on the tile, his entire body trying to break against momentum. Plats! All 3 dogs dropped as if their legs had been cut from beneath them. Their massive bodies hit the floor with audible impacts, their previous aggression evaporating into confused submission. Their heads went down, their ears flattened. Every line of their posture shifted from attack to supplication. Guardami! As one, 3 pairs of dark eyes snapped to Georgina's face and locked there, completely ignoring Marco, who was still pressed against the doorframe, or his arms shaking. The dog's focus was absolute, total, the kind of attention that couldn't be faked or forced. They were waiting, desperate for her next instruction. The restaurant had gone completely silent. No one breathed. No one moved. Georgina stood in the center of the floor, her chest heaving, her hands trembling at her sides, her carefully dyed hair falling across her face. She'd just destroyed 5 years of hiding in 3 words. 3 words spoken in a voice that everyone in this room would remember, would describe, would whisper about. Behind the frozen Rottweilers, Simone Inzaghi stood with both hands pressed to his head, his mouth hanging open in an expression of pure shock. His eyes darted between the submissive dogs and the slight waitress in the stained apron, his mind clearly struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. What? His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. What did you say to them? Georgina didn't answer. Couldn't answer. She was staring at the 3 dogs, seeing past their scars and their trauma to the confused, broken animals beneath. They hadn't wanted to attack. They'd been conditioned to attack. There was a difference, and she could see it in every line of their bodies. The lead dog, Brutus, she somehow knew his name, let out a soft whine. Not aggressive, pleading. And Georgina realized with a sinking certainty that made her knees weak that there was no walking away from this moment. No return to invisibility. No more hiding. Her father's legacy had finally caught up with her. The silence stretched like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap. Yet Georgina could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel sweat beginning to bead at her hairline despite the cool morning air. The 3 Rottweilers remained frozen in their submissive positions, their eyes never leaving her face, their bodies trembling with the effort of holding back instincts that had been beaten into them over months, maybe years. Simone's hands slowly lowered from his head. His expression shifted from shock to something far more dangerous, recognition. His eyes narrowed as he studied her, really looked at her, seeing past the mousy hair and oversized sweater to something underneath that triggered a memory he couldn't quite place. Those commands. His voice was steady now, controlled, but there was an edge of something else beneath it. Excitement. Hunger. That's not standard Italian. That's not anything standard. He took a step closer, and Georgina forced herself not to retreat. That's old Lombardic dialect, the kind nobody speaks anymore unless they learned it from... He stopped mid-sentence. His entire body went rigid. No. The word came out like a breath. No, that's impossible. The De Luca line ended. Everyone knows it ended. The old man died in prison, the son disappeared, and the daughter. His gaze raked over her again, more intense this time, cataloguing features she'd tried so hard to hide. The daughter was supposed to be dead. Georgina's throat felt like sandpaper. She wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, to become invisible one more time. But the three dogs were still staring at her, with desperate hope in their eyes, and she could feel Marco trembling behind her, and every person in this restaurant was about to pay the price for her moment of weakness. I don't know what you're talking about. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. I just know dogs. Anyone who knows dogs. Bullshit. Simone's hand moved to his jacket, and two men Georgina hadn't even noticed. How had she missed them? Materialized from near the entrance. They had the blank, efficient look of career criminals, the kind who'd seen enough violence that it no longer registered as remarkable. Nobody just knows dogs like that. Those animals were trained to kill, conditioned to ignore everything except my voice. And you shut them down in 3 words, like flipping a switch. He turned to his men without taking his eyes off Georgina. Lock the doors, front and back, or nobody leaves until she explains exactly who she is and where she learned to do that. The 2 men moved immediately. One headed for the front entrance, while the other disappeared toward the kitchen. Georgina heard the heavy thunk of a deadbolt sliding into place. Then another. The construction workers who'd been hiding under the table exchanged panicked glances. The elderly patron who'd fallen was still on the floor, too terrified to move. This is insane. Marco finally found his voice, though it shook badly. You can't just trap us here. This is my restaurant. You have no right. I have every right. Simona didn't even glance at him. His full attention was fixed on Georgina, like a laser sight. Do you have any idea what I would pay for someone who could control dogs like this? What I could do with a pack that responded to commands like that? The De Luca school was legendary. They trained animals for governments, for militaries, for people who needed absolute reliability in life or death situations. And you're telling me you just picked this up casually? Georgina's mind raced. She could try to run, but the doors were locked, and there were at least 3 armed men in the room, probably more outside. She could try to use the dogs, but they were traumatized and unpredictable, and turning them into weapons, even to save herself, would make her exactly what her father had been. She could try to explain, to negotiate, but every word would only dig the hole deeper. My name is Georgina Moretti. The lie came automatically, the fake surname she'd been using for 5 years. I worked at a veterinary clinic before this. I've just always had a way with animals. It's not Moretti. Simone's laugh was sharp and humorless. Try again. Moretti doesn't explain what I just saw. Those weren't pet commands. That was combat conditioning language, the kind that costs €500,000 to learn from the only family that ever perfected it. He crouched down suddenly, bringing himself eye level with Brutus. The dog's gaze didn't waver from Georgina. "Look at him. He's not even acknowledging me anymore. I've had these animals for 2 years, fed them, trained them, beaten the defiance out of them, and you show up and become the center of their entire universe in 30 seconds. He stood, brushing invisible dust from his trousers. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me your real name. You're going to tell me where you learned that skill, and then you're going to work for me." The afternoon sun slanted through the bistro's windows at an angle that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, casting long shadows across the checkered tablecloths and making the wine bottles on the shelves glow like colored glass. Instead, the light only emphasized how thoroughly trapped they all were. Simone had claimed the best table in the house, the corner booth with a view of both entrances, and settled in like he planned to stay for days if necessary. His men had positioned themselves strategically, one by the front door, one in the kitchen blocking the back exit, and a third had appeared from somewhere and now stood near the bathrooms, eliminating that potential escape route. Marco had been allowed to retreat behind the bar, where he stood gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The other patrons, 3 construction workers, the elderly woman who'd fallen, and a businessman who'd been trying to enjoy a quiet lunch, had been herded to the far side of the room and told to sit quietly. No one's phone worked. Simone's men had produced a signal jammer that sat on the bar like an obscene centerpiece. And Georgina stood in the middle of it all, with 3 massive Rottweilers arranged in a semicircle around her feet, their eyes tracking her every microscopic movement. "I'm waiting." Simone had ordered an espresso, from Marco, not from Georgina, and was sipping it with infuriating patience. "We have all day, all week if necessary. Eventually, you'll get tired of lying." Georgina's legs were starting to ache from standing so still. The dogs hadn't moved since her last command, but she could feel the tension radiating from them, the confusion of conflicting instincts. They'd been ordered by Simone to attack, then commanded by her to submit, and now neither authority figure was giving them clear direction. It was cruel, leaving them suspended like this. "I told you I just—" She stopped mid-sentence, because Brutus, the largest of the 3, had shifted his weight and let out a soft whine. Not aggressive, pained. Her trained eye caught what she'd missed in the chaos earlier. The way he was holding his left front paw slightly elevated, not quite touching the ground. The irregular breathing that suggested bruised or cracked ribs, or the fresh scabs along his neck where a collar had rubbed skin raw. Without thinking, she knelt down. Immediately, all 3 dogs' postures changed, ears forward, bodies leaning toward her, desperate for contact they'd probably been denied for months. "Don't touch them," Simone's voice carried a warning. "They bite." No. Georgina's hands were already moving, years of muscle memory overriding 5 years of suppression. "They've been bitten?" She gently lifted Brutus's paw, examining the swollen pad that had developed an infection from an embedded piece of glass or metal. The dog trembled, but didn't pull away. "When was the last time you had a veterinarian look at them? They're working animals, not house pets. They're suffering." She moved to Nero, the middle dog, carefully running her hands along his neck and spine. He flinched when she touched his cervical vertebrae, and she felt the telltale heat of inflammation beneath the fur. "This one has nerve damage, probably from being yanked by a choke chain hard enough to compress his spinal cord. Another few weeks and he'll start losing feeling in his front legs. He performs just fine. He performs through pain." Georgina shifted to Dante, the smallest but most alert of the 3. This one had the psychological damage more than physical. She could see it in the way his eyes darted constantly, the way his muscles never fully relaxed, the slight tremor in his hindquarters that meant he was perpetually prepared to flee or fight. And this one is going to snap eventually. You've got him wound so tight, he's one bad day away from turning on you or one of your men. She stood, her hand still shaking from touching them, from feeling the evidence of systemic abuse written into their bodies. You call them weapons, but you don't maintain them. You don't care for them. You just use them until they break, and then probably put a bullet in their heads when they're no longer useful. Simone's expression hadn't changed, but something flickered in his eyes. If you're trying to make me feel guilty, you're wasting your breath. They're tools. Expensive tools, but tools nonetheless. Tools you've damaged. Georgina's voice was harder now. That infection in Brutus's paw, that'll spread to bone within a week. The nerve damage in Nero, irreversible if not treated immediately. And Dante's psychological state means he's unpredictable, which makes him more dangerous to you than to your enemies. So fix them. No. The word hung in the air like a challenge. One of Simone's men shifted nervously. Marco made a small sound of distress from behind the bar. Simone set down his espresso cup with deliberate care. That wasn't a request. I know. Georgina met his gaze directly for the first time, abandoning the careful avoidance that had kept her safe for 5 years. But if you think I'm going to help you turn these animals into more efficient killers, you don't understand anything about what you're asking. The standoff continued as the sun began its descent, painting the bistro's walls in shades of amber and rust. Simone had grown increasingly agitated over the past hour, his patience wearing thin as Georgina continued to deflect his questions while tending to the dogs. She'd managed to convince Marco to bring her the first aid kit from the kitchen and had cleaned Brutus's infected paw with antiseptic, while the massive dog rested his head against her knee with an expression of pathetic gratitude. Finally, Simone stood abruptly, the movement sharp enough that his men tensed. This is ridiculous. We're done playing games. He gestured to one of his men. Bring the car around to the front. I need air that doesn't smell like failure and dog. He walked to the door, waited for it to be unlocked, then stepped outside onto the narrow sidewalk. Through the window, Georgina could see him light a cigarette, the ember glowing in the gathering dusk. He pulled out his phone, made a call, spoke briefly. Then he turned and pressed his face close to the glass, his breath fogging the window. Come here. His voice was muffled, but audible through the thick glass. You and I are going to have a private conversation where your bleeding heart audience can't hear us make moral judgments. Georgina looked at Marco, who shook his head frantically. The construction workers were whispering among themselves, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. The elderly woman had fallen asleep in her chair, or perhaps passed out. It was hard to tell. The businessman was praying quietly, his lips moving around words in Latin. If I refuse, then we'll continue this indefinitely. I have men, resources, and infinite patience when something I want is on the line. Simone took a long drag from his cigarette. You, however, have civilians who need to use the bathroom, who are getting hungry, who have families wondering where they are. The siege hurts you more than it hurts me. He was right, and they both knew it. Georgina stood slowly, and all 3 dogs immediately rose with her, their eyes locked on her face. Stay, she told them softly, using standard Italian this time. They hesitated, but obeyed, settling back onto their haunches with obvious reluctance. The door opened just wide enough for her to slip through, then closed and locked behind her immediately. The evening air hit her face, cool and fresh after hours in the increasingly stale restaurant. Simone had moved a few feet down the sidewalk, positioning himself where he could watch both the bistro and the street. Let me tell you what I see when I look at you. He flicked ash onto the cobblestones. I see someone who's been running. Someone who's deliberately made herself small and forgettable because she's terrified of being found. Someone who has a gift. No, a superpower, and has been wasting it serving espresso to pensioners. He turned to face her fully. I also see someone who's desperately alone. No friends, no family, no connections, just survival, day after day, in a prison of your own making. Georgina wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite her sweater. She didn't respond, wouldn't give him the satisfaction of confirming anything. I'm going to make you an offer, and I want you to truly consider it before your pride makes you refuse. Simone's voice dropped, becoming almost intimate. Work for me. I'll train my dogs, not just these 3, but the others I'm acquiring. Build me a pack that's legendary. In exchange, I'll pay you 5 million euros, set you up in a property where you can live and work in comfort. And most importantly, I'll protect you. Whatever you're running from, whoever might be looking for you, they'll have to go through me first. 5 million euros. Enough to disappear anywhere in the world, to start over with real resources instead of fake papers and stolen identities. Enough to never serve another espresso or dye her hair in a gas station bathroom or wake up at 3 in the morning convinced she'd heard her father's voice. And if I refuse? Simone's expression didn't change, but something cold slithered behind his eyes. Then I'm going to have my men douse this charming little building in gasoline. I'm going to light it on fire, and I'm going to stand right here and watch it burn with everyone inside. He took another drag from his cigarette, letting the threat hang in the smoke. Marco, those workers, that old woman, that poor businessman, all of them will die screaming because you were too stubborn to accept a generous offer. You're bluffing. You can't just murder a building full of innocent people in the middle of the city. Can't I? He smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Georgina had ever seen, not because it was cruel, but because it was genuine. I'm Simone Inzaghi, the butcher. I've done worse for less. The police won't investigate too thoroughly. The fire department will rule it an accident. And you'll spend the rest of your short, a miserable life knowing you could have saved them with one word. He dropped his cigarette and crushed it beneath his heel. Yes, Georgina had asked for time to consider the offer, and Simone, with the confidence of a man who'd already won, had granted her until dawn. He'd left 2 guards inside the bistro and departed in his black Mercedes, taking the 3rd Rottweiler's chain with him like a prop he no longer needed. The dogs were hers now, at least temporarily. He knew they wouldn't leave her side. As full darkness settled over the city, the reality of their situation crystallized with brutal clarity. Marco had tried his personal phone, his landline, even the ancient fax machine in his office. All dead, all jammed. The construction workers had attempted to force the back door, but only to discover Simone's men had chained it from the outside with a padlock that would require bolt cutters. The windows were old, thick glass, set in iron frames that would take a sledgehammer and enough noise to wake the entire block. And even if they managed to break out, where would they go? Simone had men everywhere, and now he knew exactly what Georgina looked like. The elderly woman, Signora Cardini, was running a fever. The businessman, Lorenzo, had mentioned his insulin was at home. They had perhaps 18 hours before the situation shifted from hostage crisis to medical emergency. No police were coming. No rescue was arriving. Georgina could see it in Marco's eyes as he paced behind the bar, in the slumped shoulders of the workers, in the resigned prayers of Lorenzo. As they were waiting for her to make a decision, take the blood money and condemn herself, or refuse and condemn them all. But there was a third option, one that had been forming in the back of her mind since the moment she touched Brutus's infected paw and felt his immediate, desperate trust. She'd spent 5 years running from her father's legacy. Maybe it was time to stop running and use it. Marco, her voice cut through the oppressive silence. I need you to bring me every piece of meat you have in the kitchen. Raw, cooked, doesn't matter. And water. Lots of water. He stared at her like she'd lost her mind. You're going to feed them? Now? I'm going to rebuild them. She turned to the 3 Rottweilers, who hadn't moved from their positions near her feet in apples. Or they were watching her with an intensity that would have been frightening if she didn't understand what it meant. They were waiting for structure, for purpose, for someone to finally tell them what they were supposed to be. And then we're going to walk out of here. She started with Brutus, the largest and most physically damaged. She sat cross-legged on the floor and called him to her, not with commands, but with soft invitation. He approached cautiously, and she let him sniff her hands, her face, establishing trust at his pace rather than demanding it. When he finally settled beside her, she began speaking to him in a low, steady voice. Not the combat dialect from earlier, but something softer, older. The language her grandmother had used when Georgina was small and the dogs were friends rather than weapons. She cleaned his paw again, to properly this time, and when he flinched, she didn't scold or correct. She simply waited until he relaxed, then continued. Healing couldn't be rushed. Trust couldn't be forced. You're going to be the shield, she told him, running her hands over his broad chest and shoulders. Not the sword. Shields protect. They stand between danger and the vulnerable. That's your nature, isn't it? Under all the violence they beat into you, you're a guardian. Brutus's tail moved slightly, just a fraction, but it was there. Nero came next. The nerve damage in his neck meant he'd been living in constant pain, associated with Simone's voice and proximity. She needed to recondition that response, to make safety and relief his new associations. She worked the inflamed muscles gently, finding trigger points and releasing them, now speaking continuously in that low, hypnotic cadence that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to his limbic system. You're the flank, she murmured. Fast and smart. You read situations and respond. You don't lead the charge, you support it. You watch for threats from the sides, anticipate problems before they develop. Intelligence, not aggression. His breathing began to slow, deepen. The constant tension in his shoulders started to ease. Dante was the most challenging. Psychological trauma was always harder to address than physical damage. He was hypervigilant, reactive, his stress levels so elevated that he existed in a permanent state of fight or flight. She couldn't fix that in one night, but she could give him a purpose that channeled his anxiety into something productive. Scout, she told him, to letting him pace in controlled circles around her. You're the early warning system. Your job isn't to fight, it's to alert, to notice, to tell the others when something's wrong. That nervousness you feel, that's not weakness, that's sensitivity. That's valuable. She worked through the night with methodical precision, breaking down years of abuse conditioning and replacing it with new frameworks, new associations, new purposes. She assigned each dog a role that aligned with their natural temperament rather than fighting against it. She used food rewards, gentle touch, and most importantly, consistency. Every correct response earned immediate positive reinforcement. Every moment of trust was acknowledged and honored. The 2 guards watched with bored confusion, occasionally checking their phones. DeMarco had fallen asleep sitting up behind the bar. The other hostages dozed fitfully in their chairs. And as the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the windows, 3 Rottweilers sat in formation before Georgina. Not as weapons, but as a team, each understanding their role, each looking to her for guidance. She stood, her body aching from hours on the floor, and met their eyes one by one. "Are you ready?" 3 tails wagged in perfect synchronization. Dawn never came. Instead, at 5:47 a.m., Georgina checked Marco's wall clock the moment she smelled it. The acrid scent of gasoline began seeping under the front door. She was on her feet instantly, the 3 dogs rising with her in perfect synchronization, their ears alert but their bodies calm, waiting for her direction. "But what is that?" Lorenzo's voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. He'd been awake most of the night, rationing his remaining insulin and trying not to think about what would happen when it ran out. The 2 guards exchanged glances. One pulled out his phone, stepped toward the window. His face went pale. "Boss is outside, with 5 men. They're pouring." He didn't finish the sentence. Through the window, Georgina could see Simone standing across the narrow street, his silhouette backlit by the street lamp, watching the bistro with the patient attention of a man observing an experiment. 2 of his men were methodically splashing gasoline along the building's foundation, the liquid gleaming black in the pre-dawn light. The fumes were already making her eyes water. "He's actually doing it." Marco's voice was barely a whisper. "Madre de Dio, he's actually going to burn us alive." One of the guards tried his phone again, then looked at his companion. "He's not answering. What do we—" The back door exploded inward with a crash that shook the entire building. Not the chained door. They'd breached through Marco's office, coming through the wall with a sledgehammer or maybe a small ram. Smoke began billowing in immediately, thick and black and chemical-smelling. Not from fire yet, but from smoke grenades, designed to disorient and terrify. "Everyone down!" Georgina's command was sharp, automatic. The civilians dropped instantly, conditioned by hours of fear to obey any authoritative voice. The 2 guards inside raised their weapons, but they were confused, pointing them toward the smoke, but unable to see targets. Through the churning grey-black clouds, Georgina heard boots on tile, multiple sets, at least 3 men, maybe 4, moving with tactical precision toward the main room. They were coming to evacuate Simone's guards before lighting the fire, or maybe just to make sure no one escaped. She had perhaps 15 seconds before they reached the dining area. 15 seconds to make a choice she'd sworn 5 years ago she would never make again. The 3 Rottweilers were pressed against her legs, their bodies tense but controlled, waiting. Not reacting to the smoke or the noise or the danger, reacting only to her. She could feel their focus like a physical force, their absolute trust that she would tell them what to do, how to survive this. She thought of her father, standing in the training yard of their estate, surrounded by dogs who would kill on his command. She thought of the way he'd smiled when they performed perfectly, the same smile he'd worn when reading about the people those dogs had torn apart. She thought of the promise she'd made to herself in the back of a truck crossing the Austrian border. Never again. But these weren't her father's dogs anymore. And this wasn't murder. This was survival. She dropped to one knee, bringing her face level with Brutus, Nero, and Dante. Their eyes locked onto hers with laser intensity. She touched each of their heads, a moment of connection, of acknowledgement. Then she spoke in the old Lombardic dialect, the words her grandmother had taught her long before her father had corrupted everything they meant. Hunt, protect the pack, disable, don't kill, go. The 3 dogs vanished into the smoke like ghosts. But what happened next occurred in near-perfect silence, which somehow made it more terrifying than if there had been screaming. Georgina heard a muffled grunt, then the clatter of a weapon hitting tile, a curse cut short, the heavy thud of a body falling, then another. The smoke was so thick now she could barely see 3 feet in front of her. But she didn't need to see. She could track the dogs by sound, by the subtle shifts in air pressure as they moved. Brutus had taken the point man. She heard the distinctive sound of his mass hitting someone's center of gravity, a shield bash that sent the target sprawling. Nero was working the flanks, his damaged neck apparently not hindering his ability to sweep legs and jar weapons from grips with precise strikes from his shoulders and hips. And Dante, nervous, more hyper-vigilant Dante, was doing exactly what she'd trained him for, circling and alerting, his soft growls guiding the other two toward threats in the smoke. They weren't mauling, they weren't tearing flesh, they were using their mass and speed to disable, exactly as she'd commanded. Another body hit the floor. Then silence. The smoke began to clear slightly as the ventilation system struggled against the assault. Through the haze, Georgina could make out shapes on the floor. 4 men, conscious but groaning, their weapons scattered across the tile. The 2 guards who'd been inside the bistro were pressed against the wall, their faces masks of shock. The 3 Rottweilers emerged from the dissipating smoke and returned to Georgina's side, taking up their formation. Not a drop of blood on any of them. Brutus's tail was wagging. Outside, through the window, she could see Simone's expression had changed from patient confidence to something else entirely. He'd underestimated what she could do. He wouldn't make that mistake again. The gasoline hadn't been lit yet, but Georgina could see Simone's man standing ready with a lighter, waiting for the signal. Through the smoke-stained window, their eyes met. His filled with the dawning realization that his carefully orchestrated intimidation had gone catastrophically wrong, hers burning with something she'd kept buried for 5 years. She walked to the front door. The guard stationed there looked at his phone, at her, at the 3 Rottweilers flanking her like an honor guard, then made the smartest decision of his life and unlocked it without being asked. The cool morning air hit her face as she stepped onto the sidewalk. The contrast from the smoke-filled bistro so sharp it made her dizzy for a moment. Behind her, she heard Marco and the others beginning to emerge, coughing and gasping, but alive. The sound of their survival settled something in her chest. Simone stood 20 feet away, his expensive suit rumpled from the long night, his carefully groomed beard unable to hide the tension in his jaw. His remaining men, 3 of them, since 4 were currently groaning on the bistro floor, had their hands near their weapons, but hadn't drawn yet, unsure of the protocol for this situation. "That wasn't part of the deal," Simone said, his voice still carrying that edge of control, though she could hear the strain beneath it. "You were supposed to make a choice. Accept my offer or let them burn. You weren't supposed to." He gestured at the bistro, at the incapacitated men inside. "This changes things." "Yes." Georgina took 3 steps forward, and the dogs moved with her in perfect synchronization, their movements fluid and coordinated. "It does. You think because you handled a few of my men in the confusion of smoke that you've won something?" Simone's hand moved to his jacket, and Georgina's breath caught. "You think this ends with you walking away?" The gun came out smoothly, professionally, a sleek black Beretta that probably cost more than Marco made in 6 months. Simone didn't point it at Georgina. He pointed it at Brutus, the largest target, the easiest kill. "Call them off. Tell them to lie down, or I start putting bullets in them. Orson, we'll see how quickly your legendary DeLuca training holds up against—" The command left Georgina's throat before he finished the sentence. One word in Old Lombardic, sharp as a blade, carrying every ounce of authority she'd inherited from 3 generations of master trainers. The 3 dogs moved with such perfect coordination, it looked choreographed. Brutus approached from the front, his massive chest lowered, his eyes locked on Simone's gun hand. Nero swept wide right, positioning himself at an angle that would allow him to strike from the flank. Dante circled left, completing the triangle, his nervous energy finally channeled into something purposeful and controlled. They didn't snarl, didn't bark, didn't display any of the theatrical aggression that Simone had beaten into them. They simply surrounded him in a formation that was mathematically perfect, closing off every escape route, every angle of defense. 3 points of a triangle with Simone trapped at the center, each dog positioned precisely where they could reach him in less than a second if he made the wrong move. Simone's hand began to shake. The gun wavered, tracking from one dog to another, unable to decide which threat to address first, because they were all equally positioned, equally ready. His breathing quickened. Sweat beaded on his upper lip despite the cool morning air. "Call them off." His voice had lost all its authority, cracking on the last word. "I'm warning you, you'll what?" Georgina's voice was quiet, but it carried across the empty street like a bell. "Shoot one. You might get one bullet off before the other two reach you. Or maybe two if you're very lucky and very fast. But you won't get three, and they won't be trying to disable you the way they did your men. They'll be protecting themselves. Do you understand the difference?" The gun dropped from Simone's hand, clattering on the cobblestones. His arms rose slowly, palms out, the universal gesture of surrender. His men looked at each other, unsure whether to intervene. But something in Georgina's expression, or perhaps in the perfect, lethal stillness of the 3 dogs, kept their weapons holstered. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Someone on the street must have finally called the police when they saw armed men pouring gasoline on a building. Or maybe Marco had managed to get through. It didn't matter. Help was coming. Georgina gave another command, and the 3 dogs broke formation, while returning to her side in perfect heels. She reached down and touched each of their heads, a gesture of gratitude and acknowledgement. They had trusted her completely, and she had honored that trust by giving them purpose instead of violence. "You wanted to know who I am," she said to Simone, who stood frozen in the center of the street, his face ashen. "I'm Georgina De Luca, daughter of Antonio De Luca, granddaughter of Maria De Luca, the last of a bloodline that understood something you never will. Power isn't about domination. It's about connection, trust, respect." She paused, letting the sirens grow louder. "My family lost their way when they forgot that. When they started treating animals as weapons instead of partners. I won't make that mistake." She turned and began walking, the 3 Rottweilers moving with her in perfect formation. Not ahead, not behind, but beside her, equals rather than servants. Behind them, Simone remained standing in the street, his empire of fear dismantled by 1 woman and 3 dogs who'd finally found someone worthy of their loyalty. The sun was rising now, painting the narrow street in shades of gold and pink. Georgina didn't look back. She had spent 5 years running from her name, her legacy, her gift. She was done running. The dogs had taught her that strength without compassion was just cruelty, but compassion without strength was merely victimhood. She had finally found the balance between the two. True power doesn't come from fear or force, but from respect and trust earned through compassion. Those who lead through abuse and intimidation ultimately rule over nothing but their own isolation, while those who lead with understanding and purpose build loyalty that cannot be broken. The greatest strength lies not in dominating others, but in helping them become the best versions of themselves. And sometimes the path to redemption begins with accepting the parts of ourselves we've been running from and choosing to use them wisely rather than bury them completely.